My contribution to these presentations about scientists supporting religion concern evolution as well as the origin of life. Anyone who's interested in evolution should know something about Charles Darwin, his life, his times, his ideas, their impact upon his friends and others, and so on. Now, people have long wondered, where did the various kinds of plants and animals come from? Traditionally, it was believed that God created them individually, one by one. And as a matter of fact, their complexity, the complexity of living organisms, suggests that they were designed. The idea of creation by God is very ancient. Bible verses can be quoted. Creationists love to quote the 19th Psalm that says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork." I have enjoyed the 139th Psalm, in which David thanks God for understanding his construction as he was being formed in his mother's womb. But the one I like the best is from Romans, and I like the J.B. Phillips translation. It's very clear. "For since the beginning of the world, the invisible attributes of God, for example, his eternal power and divinity, have been plainly discernible through things which he has made, and which are commonly seen and known, thus leaving these men without a rag of excuse. They knew all the time there is a God." Way back in 1691, John Ray wrote a book entitled "The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of the Creation." And a little over 100 years later, William Paley wrote another important book, apparently inspired by Ray's book, "Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence of Attributes of Deity, Collected from the Appearances of Nature." Paley's watch analogy was, and is still, very famous. He opens his book with it. Say that you found a stone in a watch by a trail. You might assume that the stone was always there, but it would be clear that the watch had a maker. Its design makes that clear. And there was more to his analogy, if you have time someday to read it all. Anyway, Darwin was brought up on Paley's book, not only as a young student, but also at Cambridge, where he was working on his divinity degree. Now, Paley went on to suggest, as you would imagine, that the apparent design of living organisms, plants and animals, exhibits clearly that they must have had an intelligent designer. And that argument is called the argument from design. It was then, and it still is. Today, we might say that William Paley was an early intelligent design creationist. I mean, he certainly was. But there were philosophers and scientists at that time who had other ideas. The idea of evolution, or descent with modification, was also being discussed, contrary to the idea that species were created individually. For one thing, plants and animals could be classified into logical trees, as if each one higher on the tree might have descended with modification, that is, evolved, from the one below it, while the one below did, or did not, survive. Even fossils could be organized in a logical way. And it was suggested maybe it all happened in natural ways, without an intelligent designer. But if evolution happened without God, just how could that work? Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monet, Chevalier de Lamarck, wrote books in 1802 and 1809 in which he proposed the mechanism of the inheritance of acquired characters. Lamarck's most famous example concerned giraffes, getting longer necks and forelegs by stretching higher and higher for leaves, and then producing baby giraffes that had longer necks and forelegs. It's called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Here's some giraffes getting taller and taller. Well, that isn't the way it happened. Lamarck was wrong. This is how they really reached higher leaves. I have a couple of stories that go along with that. For one thing, when I was a student at Caltech, we had to pass language examinations in German and French, and my French paragraph was entitled Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, le grand Pierre de biologie. Well, indeed, in many ways, Lamarck was the grandfather of biology. He made many contributions to the science of life. Incidentally, I passed the translation, but I've forgotten most of my French by now. The second little story is that Erasmus Darwin, who was the grandfather of Charles Darwin, wrote a few years before Lamarck about evolution, and indeed he wrote about the inheritance of acquired characters before Lamarck's book came out. Zoonomia even suggested natural selection, which was the heart of Charles Darwin's theory. Why didn't people pay more attention? Well, perhaps because Erasmus Darwin wrote much of his science as poetry. And I've been interested as I've read the works of Charles Darwin, to see that Charles seemed to be almost oblivious of his grandfather's writings and ideas. I never really came across references to his grandfather. We need to learn a bit about Charles Robert Darwin. He was born February 12, 1809 in Shrewsbury, England, about 150 miles northeast of London. His father was the very wealthy and very prestigious Dr. Robert Darwin. His grandfather Erasmus was also a doctor. Robert Darwin married Susanna Wedgwood of the wealthy and famous Wedgwood pottery family. She died when Charles was only 8 years old. It was logical for Charles to become a doctor like his father and grandfather, and his brother Erasmus for that matter. So he attended medical school in Edinburgh. He didn't like his classes, but he became close to Robert Grant, who was a wonderful naturalist, but also an atheist. Darwin learned a lot of how to collect, how to preserve specimens, and so on. It's interesting to me that friendship did not continue through the years, although they both were pretty much in London. After watching 2 operations without anesthesia, one on a child, Charles left school. Well, what was to be done? He went to the University of Cambridge to study for the ministry, which at least was a respectable profession, like being a doctor, perhaps. His family was not religious. They leaned toward Unitarianism, but seldom attended church, except Christmas and Easter. Darwin didn't enjoy his religious studies either, but he graduated in 1831 with a bachelor's degree in theology, I presume. At Cambridge, he had 2 important mentors. Both of them were clerics with congregations of their own on the Sundays. One was John Stevens Henslow, a botanist and lifelong friend, although he died just 3 years after Darwin's famous book was published. Adam Sedgwick was a geologist. He took Darwin on a 3-week tour of northern England, teaching him the techniques of geology, enough so that Darwin became a geologist, claimed to be a geologist for the rest of his life. Well, in 1831, a very important letter came inviting Darwin to join the voyage of HMS Beagle, which was going to sail around the world for 2 years. Turned out to be 5 years. The captain was Captain Robert Fitzroy, who wanted someone like Darwin on board with whom he could take his meals. He could not take his meals with officers on the ship because that would show favoritism. But Darwin was a naturalist and had nothing to do with running the ship. The Beagle spent 4 years surveying the coasts of South America. Darwin's had many days ashore. Whenever the ship docked, he would get off and sometimes stay for weeks, studying the biology and the geology of South America. Many of his very important convictions throughout his life were formed during that trip. A very important stop for Darwin was the Galapagos Islands. They were almost on the equator, very beautiful. I would love to visit sometime. While there, for a matter of weeks, as I remember, Darwin formed a number of important ideas about speciation, how species could form. But it was interesting to me as I read about Darwin's trip that he was able to send large boxes of rocks, plants, animals, along with letters and journals back to London. He received mail wherever they stopped. Mail would be waiting for him at the port. Some of his observations were very important to his later thinking. Henslow gave him a copy of Charles Lyell's book on geology before embarking on the Beagle. Henslow said, "Read this carefully, but don't believe a word." Well, Lyell's book was a detailed argument for uniformitarianism, which is the idea that things going on today, particularly erosion, uplift, volcanoes, and so on, could account for what we see in the Earth's shape and features this day. And Darwin saw many evidences for this idea. It was clear to Darwin that the Earth is millions of years old. My designer, Steve Murdoch, found these wonderful illustrations from Lyell's book. For Darwin, there were big events during 1836 to 1838. He moved into a house in London where he worked on his Beagle collections, and perhaps most importantly, he met the geologist Charles Lyell, who became a lifetime friend. 1837, he started notebooks on the speciation problem, working and wondering. 1838 was an especially big year for Darwin. He realized that he always had loved his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, and he married her. They had 10 children, 2 that died in infancy, and Annie, who died at 10, which was very difficult for Charles and for Emma. His father had promised that when Darwin was married, he would give him a house to live in, and he did, in the village of Down, 15 miles south of London. And it was in this house and garden that he worked on his theories of evolution by natural selection. He lived in this house, the one in the picture, for the rest of his life. I was kind of impressed that he commissioned a sand path at Down House for his regular exercise. To begin with, that meant he had to have a pretty good layout of property to build a circular sand path, but he did. In 1838, another very important thing happened. He read Thomas Malthus' book, and he realized the idea of natural selection, which is the key name for Darwin's theory. Darwin didn't invent evolution. He suggested one way that it might work, natural selection. There are 4 principles to the idea of natural selection. First is the snowflake principle that says no 2 organisms are exactly alike. And this is because organisms are extremely complex. There's a tendency for the genes to change, to mutate. But it's very important to note that science didn't yet know about genes at the time of Darwin, as we'll see a little later. Even identical twins are not exactly identical. Principle number 2 is based on Thomas Malthus' book, which pointed out that all populations have the potential to increase geometrically by compound interest. Sometime around maybe 1960, I dreamed up an example involving ducks. I let each duck occupy a volume of 1 liter. I let each pair of ducks have 8 offspring per year for 5 years, and then the offsprings did the same. At the end of 5 years, there were 3,622 liters worth of ducks. That's a lot of ducks. That's close to a 4-fold increase each 5 years. And at that rate of increase, Earth is solidly covered with ducks in a mere 21 years. And the volume of ducks equals the volume of the Earth by the 34th year. Say the population only doubles every 5 years. Earth's surface is covered in just 207 years. And the volume of ducks equals the Earth's volume in just 333 years. The third principle is the struggle for existence principle. With such rapid population growth, the resources, food, etc., soon become limiting. So with that overproduction, some members will perish. many due to predators, others by starvation, sickness, and so on. Only a few can survive to keep the population from completely overrunning its resources. I had an office in Salt Lake City at a place called Old Farm, beautiful place. In the spring, there were little flocks of ducks following their mother duck. But by the end of the summer, there was virtually no sign of them. And of course, there were wild cats at Old Farm. The fourth principle is the survival of the fittest. On average, and obviously with many exceptions, those best suited to their environments will be the ones that survive to reproduce. So, based on this principle, there will be a natural selection of the most fit members in a population, Darwin speculated. And he speculated that this could lead to new species that develop from previous ones, given enough time. And Lyell had indeed given him enough time, millions of years. Darwin realized that his theory was very simple, although it took him many years to arrive at it. He wondered why others didn't see it as clearly. Darwin realized that domestic species are the product of artificial selection as contrasted to natural selection. Some domestic species have changed so much from their original natural state that they can no longer survive in natural environment. A good example is modern corn. Started out as teosinte. No one knows for sure when, but it was probably before Christ, a few hundred years. It had a tiny little ear, but as time went on, mutations occurred, unknown in Darwin's time, incidentally. And by now, we have large ears of corn growing on maize stalks. It's interesting that maize lasts only 1 or 2 years if not cultivated. And this is true for many cultivated plants or animals. They can't make it in the wild. In the case of maize, it's because the husks don't release the seeds. Sheep don't do very well in the wild either. But wild horses, on the other hand, seem to be quite adapted to semi-deserts and do very well. Darwin sat on his ideas for 20 years. Why didn't he publish sooner? Or perhaps because he worried about reaction from his religious friends. And his closest religious friend was his wife, Emma, who wrote him a couple of letters, only about 2 in their lifetime together, worrying about how he was moving away from the idea of a creator God. So Darwin spent 8 years studying his beloved barnacles, perhaps putting off his confrontation with the rest of the world about natural selection. Darwin kept collecting relevant information. He filled notebooks and wrote abstracts, and he confided his ideas to a few close friends. One of them was the geologist Charles Lyell. Another was the botanist Joseph Hooker, who worked at Kew Gardens. John Henslow remained a good friend. A younger member of the group was Thomas Huxley, who became very convinced of the truth of natural selection. Asa Gray was an American who visited London and met Darwin, and after that they were correspondents for many years. As we'll see, one of the letters that Darwin wrote played an important role. Here's an indication of the letter to Asa Gray in the United States. Well, at that point, it's time to introduce Alfred Russel Wallace. He loved nature like Darwin, but he grew up poor, unlike Darwin. He and a friend, H.W. Bates, talked about the species problem. Wallace spent 4 years collecting in the Amazon for specimens to be sold to collectors in London. Most of that time he was with his friend Bates. He spent 1 year in London, where he met Darwin briefly. And then he went to the Malay Archipelago, where he continued to collect specimens for sale in England. Wallace's first evolution paper, written in 1854 but published in 1855, made a strong case that evolution happened, but without suggesting how it might have happened. Darwin read it, assumed that Wallace was a creationist because Wallace had used the term created in the paper. But Darwin's friends took the paper much more seriously. They warned that Wallace was getting close. Interesting to me that one of those friends was Edward Blythe, clear away in India. He read Wallace's paper, decided it was getting close to what Darwin's thoughts were, so Darwin must have been corresponding with him too, and he warned Darwin. Darwin then took Wallace's paper much more seriously. He wrote 2 letters to Wallace, trying to subtly claim his territory in the species problem. Desmond and Moore, Darwin's biographers, said that these letters were the nicest kind of trespass notice. Though agreeing with you on your conclusion in that paper, I believe I go much further than you, but it's too long a subject to enter on my speculative notions. In 1858, Wallace was collecting when he fell ill with malaria. Sick in bed, his mind worked on that species problem again. And like Darwin, he remembered the book by Thomas Malthus, Essays on Principle of Population. And with that, in a flash of insight, Wallace saw how natural selection might lead to new species. He saw the picture just like Darwin had. He made notes while his malaria subsided. Wallace felt better in a day or two, and he wrote a paper on March 1st, 1858. He sent it off to Darwin. It arrived on June 18th in 1858, causing panic at Down House. Illustrating the panic, Darwin wrote to Lyell, "So all my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed." Well, Darwin's friends assembled it down. As it turns out, there was to be a meeting of the LINNEAN Society on July 1st, 1858, a week or 2 after the paper was received at Down House. And Darwin's newborn baby had died of scarlet fever, so he couldn't attend the meeting. 2 days before the meeting, Darwin sent 2 documents to Hooker and Lyell for polishing. At the meeting, they presented 3 papers of Darwin. One, an abstract that he had written as long ago as 1844, showing that he maybe deserved a lot of priority. The second was the letter to Asa Gray, the American botanist, in which he had outlined the whole theory. And then they also presented the paper that had arrived at Down House, written by Wallace. All 3 papers were eventually published. What was the reaction to the paper? Nil. But the word soon spread. Darwin's friend said he must publish details of his theory. Wallace was extremely grateful that his paper had been published without going through review or anything. Darwin went to work on his 2,000-page abstract that he had collected, and he condensed that to a 500-page book, which was published on November 22nd, 1859. The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. All 1,250 copies sold out on the day that they appeared. And this cartoon, according to my designer, Steve Murdoch, is a contemporary cartoon written at that time. Well, the secret was out. And that's about as much as I'm going to say about the story of Darwin, except to review a few books that he had published. One in 1862, having to do with orchids. One, actually a 2-volume one in 1868, The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication. Another 2-volume version in 1871, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. Here, for the first time, Darwin did mention that man might have evolved from the primates. 1872, he published a book on the expression of emotion in man and in animals. He wasn't done yet. 1875, a book on insectivorous plants. 1875 again, on the movement and habits of climbing plants. He really liked plants. 1876, another book on plants, cross-fertilization. 1877, different forms of flowers on plants of the same species. And finally, in 1880, with his son Francis, he published a book entitled The Power of Movement in Plants. This was the most important of Darwin's books. For me, in my profession, I studied how plants respond by moving, respond to gravity, to light, even to moisture and other things. Well, Charles Darwin died on the 19th of April, 1882, at age 73. Although he was widely considered to be an atheist, his funeral was held in Westminster Abbey, where all the greats had been buried. After his death, Darwin's son Francis had a book published that he had just finished, The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms. And Francis got a hold of an autobiography that Darwin had written, mostly for his family, short one, only 100 pages. But Francis had it published, along with many memories of his father and several of his father's letters. Now, a very important question. How did Darwin's friends react to the principle of natural selection? T.H. Huxley was the strongest supporter, Darwin's bulldog, they called him. But he was also interested in theology. He coined the term agnostic, applying it to himself. Joseph Hooker was mostly converted, almost as much as Huxley. Charles Lyell supported Darwin for many years, but in a long letter to Darwin, he wrote, "I still see the necessity of continued intervention of creative power." This was quite upsetting to Darwin. Still more friends. John Henslow defended Darwin, especially his character, and he became partially converted, but continued to believe in divine intervention. Remember, he was a cleric, preacher. Adam Sedgwick, who had taught Darwin what he knew about geology at one time, was very much opposed. "I have read your book with more pain than pleasure. Parts of it I admired greatly. Parts I laughed at till my sides were almost sore. Other parts I read with absolute sorrow because I think them utterly false and grievously mischievous. You have deserted the true method of induction and started in machinery as wild, I think, as Bishop Wilkins' locomotive that was to sail with us to the moon." Still more friends. Robert Fitzroy was bitterly opposed also, but more on religious grounds. Asa Gray was a strong supporter of Darwin in America, but at the same time, he was a firm believer in God. He criticized natural selection as the creator of organs such as the eye, and he never really believed that humans evolved. I happen to have a picture hanging on my wall, taken in 1877, just a few years before Darwin died. Two friends of his, Asa Gray, is sitting with his plant press. Joseph Hooker had come from England to tour the Rocky Mountains with Asa Gray, and Mrs. Gray is the lovely lady on the far right. The picture was taken on Levita Pass, Colorado, 1877. Louis Agassiz. There was Louis Agassiz. He was a Swiss-born paleontologist who studied fossils. In 1846, he received an offer from Harvard University, where he settled and stayed for the rest of his life. So he was really, in a sense, an American paleontologist. His life overlapped that of Darwin quite closely. They were born and died at pretty close to the same times. He was considered to be the leading paleontologist of his time. So Darwin sent him a copy of The Origin of Species, no doubt hoping for Agassiz's endorsement. But Agassiz was not impressed. He said Darwin's outline of gradual evolution did not match the fossil record. And specifically, Agassiz was aware of the Cambrian explosion, in which several highly complex animals belonging to several major groups, phyla, appeared in the oldest strata containing fossils, that is, with no precursor fossils in any older strata. And where were the missing links? Agassiz asked. Those reasons, incidentally, were also the reasons that Adam Sedgwick, Darwin's old mentor, had become so skeptical. Darwin and Agassiz carried on a friendly correspondence about this problem for years, but at that time it was still possible for Darwin to suggest that precursor fossils would be found to solve the problem. Now it's been 200 years of careful study, and this is still a major problem for Darwinian evolution. Strata older than the Cambrian strata have been found, but they don't contain precursor fossils to those found in the Cambrian explosion. Incidentally, a lot of things were named after Agassiz because he was such a famous guy. Mount Agassiz is a peak east of Mirror Lake in the Uinta Mountains of Utah, for example. I got about halfway up with a friend who became altitude sick, and we had to go back down. Well, Alfred Russel Wallace has a very complicated story. He always gave Darwin credit for natural selection and originally argued that humans were products of evolution. But in 1865, he became interested in spiritualism. He became convinced that spirit communication was real, and he proclaimed his belief for the rest of his life. This led to doubts that the human mind and some anatomical features were products of evolution. Rather, in Wallace's mind, they required a creator. Darwin was not amused. He wrote to Wallace, "I hope that you have not murdered too completely your own and my child." Question: was Charles Darwin an atheist? He never said that he was, but on several occasions he came very close to saying so. There's a quotation that touches me because he rebelled against the Christianity of his time. He could not see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. It seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brother, almost all my best friends, will be everlastingly punished. And this is a damnable doctrine. Taken as he stated it, I can't help but agree. Steve Murdoch threw in this interesting little cartoon. What do you do if you're an atheist and you don't want to swear on the Bible? Well, you swear on Darwin's Origin of Species. Now it's time to jump ahead to some of our present views. With the development of genetics during the early 20th century, evidence developed that the source of variety was primarily mutations, spontaneous changes in genes caused by natural selection and other factors. Until the discovery of genetics, right around 1900, the origin of variability in populations was not known. And until that time, evolution by natural selection of advantageous variety in populations was called Darwinism, logically. But when genetics and mutations were added to Darwinism, the theory was then called the new synthesis, or more commonly, neo-Darwinism. Interestingly enough, the idea that mutations could be induced by natural environmental factors was not really shown until 1926 by Hermann Muller, who got a Nobel Prize for his work. Incidentally, I have a presentation on the big numbers that looks into these things in somewhat more detail. I want to present some personal scientific convictions to wind up this presentation. I have 10 of them. For first off, there's strong evidence that Earth is of ancient age and that evolution of organisms has been going on for many millions of years. Second, natural selection can be observed in nature and in the laboratory, and especially with bacteria in the laboratory. Natural selection is a valid principle that I will question in some ways, but basically stand up for. My next conviction is that a question more than a statement. Can natural selection be the primary mechanism in evolution? I don't know, but I do know that it will depend on the extent of genetic variability. That is, it will depend upon the extent of the mutation. Darwin himself realized the problem of the origin of variations in populations. He actually reverted to acceptance of Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics. To do so, he cooked up a theory of pangenes, a theory that was pretty thoroughly rejected by his contemporaries and should have been. In relation to the question of whether mutations will account for evolution over the broadest sense, we need to realize that if mutations are all bad, and indeed most are deleterious to the organism possessing them, selection will tend to remove them and stabilize the population, but it will not improve it. And this is called conservative natural selection. It was even suggested by that Indian scientist, Edward Blyth, actually a little before Darwin's time. Now, evolutionary natural selection depends on the spontaneous appearance of mutations that will account for an increased ability to reproduce. That is, for the individual to survive and reproduce, pass on the good mutations. We've talked about artificial selection and seen that plants and animals that have been domesticated illustrate that that works. Another conviction, number 6. Considering the fantastic complexity of each and every gene and the protein it controls, I'm not convinced that progressive mutations can occur fast enough for natural selection to account for evolution of all species. That is, I worry about things like the Cambrian explosion and so on. Number 7 is a very important conclusion, and it's based upon the small protein molecule called insulin. It has just 51 amino acids, but a protein of that length can exist in, that huge number that you see down below. It was the first protein to have its amino acids sequenced, and I see that as being extremely important because before that, many assumed that proteins were at least somewhat amorphous. But knowing the protein function depended upon specific amino acid sequences introduced a level of life's complexity unimaginable in the time of Darwin. The achievement of sequencing insulin was by Friedrich Sanger, and it was published in the mid-1900s, earned him his first Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1958. He went on to develop methods for sequencing the nucleic acids as well. And with 3 others, he was awarded his second Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1980 for the DNA work, which ultimately led to the sequencing of the human genome by others. Well, when Sanger died, not too long ago, a good Nobel Prize winning friend of his, John Walker, wrote a kind of a tribute to him in Nature magazine, the granddaddy of all scientific journals. Walker said, Sanger's impact on biology is as dramatic as that of Charles Darwin. And I relate to this statement very much so. Sanger showed us that life is of digital nature, run as a code, the codes of the genes and so on. We had suspected it, I admit, but Sanger was the one who showed it. Well, at number 7, we're light years away from understanding how life could have originated on the primitive Earth. That's another story, though, not even part of the natural selection story, and I have a separate presentation on it. Number 8 is that science has a long way to go before evolution and natural selection are completely understood. That is, science has not proven that life on Earth appeared without an intelligent creator, nor that life did require such a creator. Science simply can't study divine creation, can't study the supernatural relating to God. Now, I have more an intuitive doubt than a conviction. It worries me that some very minor adaptations seem to be more than a matter of convenience than survival value. An intelligent designer could easily include them, but can we account for them by natural selection? I was thinking of an example, trying to think of an example, when I was putting on my hearing aids. I realized that earwax might be helpful to the unaided ear by preventing too much drying. But does it provide survival value? How do you evolve earwax? There are several metabolic and enzymatic steps that are required to create earwax in the ears and not other places in the body. So suitable genes would have to appear by mutation. It would have to be recruited from wax genes already in the genome, perhaps. And that's quite a complex thing. And so the mutation route seems quite unlikely to me. What's the other route? Well, although wax metabolism is common in some organisms, especially plants, it's not quite like earwax. So some genetic modification would still be required even if the basic wax producing mechanism were present in the early human beings. There would have to be a developmental program, as I suggested a minute ago, that would have to appear to ensure that the cells in the embryonic epidermis of the ear will be activated to carry out wax metabolism at the correct rate to lubricate, but not to fill the ear with wax. It's really quite complicated when you think about it. So our early ancestors, where earwax first appeared, presumably didn't scratch their ears as often or something. Was that such an advantage in survival and production of offspring that it changed the population over time? Maybe something like that did happen. I think most modern biologists would suggest that it did. But I have a lot of difficulty in squaring it simply with my intuition. I don't know, but I don't like the idea much. Final point. Science is compatible with my religious convictions. Study of science, especially biology, has been a wonderful and rewarding part of my life, and so is the study of religion. Well, remember, individual convictions can depend on many things, including biology. So, hang in there. And that is the end.